Hi. Today, we're at a place that always makes me feel like a kid in a candy store, the used bookstore. I love coming here. It's always like a treasure hunt. You never find the same thing twice, and you never know what you're gonna find. Sometimes I come in looking for something specific, and every now and then I'll find it. But usually I like to just come in when I'm ready to browse and see what the bookstore hands me. Of its hundreds and hundreds of shelves. I was excited because recently this particular used bookstore expanded to almost twice its size. And now there's almost too much to explore. I find it's most fun to just come in and pick a few sections and take a few books off the shelves, peek inside. I always love the art section in particular. Let's see what we have here. Here's a book on portraits. Let's take a look inside. It's funny, I used to think that portraiture was kind of a boring art form. I would look at it and just sort of see faces and faces and faces and faces of people that I didn't feel a connection to, and it often seemed kind of stiff and formal. But now I've come to appreciate it more, especially as I've recently started creating some portraits myself. The human face becomes more and more interesting the more you look at it, I think. And it's also pretty cool how artists have special ways of looking at faces that not everybody maybe has. And it's also interesting how many styles of portraiture there are. I really like these more realistic ones. But I think it's really cool to see them alongside Cubist portraits and Impressionist portraits. There's our friend Van Gogh, or as the British say, Van Gogh. Hello, Vincent. This is an absolutely gorgeous series of books. There was a part of me that just wanted to swipe them all up and put them on my bookshelf. They were only $2 a piece, which is amazing. But I thought we could look at one of them at least. It's a little tough to get out of its box. I think it's kind of special, though, to have a book that's in a box cover. So this is The World of Whistler. I'm just going to kind of flip through. I like Whistler's paintings. You're probably familiar with his painting of his mother, which I don't think I flipped by as I'm flipping in this book. Oh, that one right there is one of his nocturnes, which I really, really love. His nocturnes in black and gold. I think there might be one in blue and gold. Are some of my favorite paintings. And not every painting in this book is actually by Whistler, since we're focused here on the world of Whistler. So they also talk about some of the other artists who are around the same time period. And I was excited to see that the Pre-Raphaelites artwork is included in this book. You can see some of it right there. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, if you don't know about them, look them up. They're some of my favorite artists of all times. Just a quick flip through. also love browsing the children's section. I think one of the most fun parts about being a mom is reading children's books. And my daughter and I go to the library probably every 3 weeks or so and get a new batch of books. And we found some really good ones. The Velveteen Rabbit always makes me cry. Do you have a favorite children's book? If you have a favorite children's book, I would love it if you would comment what it is, because I'm always looking for recommendations for books to read with my daughter. I'm particularly fond of fairy tales. I really like Rumpelstiltskin. But I also just love reading myths and legends, fairy tales from all around the world. It's really fascinating to see how the same stories repeat in different cultures. Books, 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 books. The wonderful smell of old books. So what I thought we'd mostly focus on here in our browsing is this shelf. And this is a shelf of classics. So I'm just going to pull a few off. We'll take a look inside and maybe read the first paragraph or two of each. I hope you'll enjoy it. Feel free to close your eyes and drift off if you'd like. First book is Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and we'll read the first 2 paragraphs since the first paragraph is so short. On an exceptionally hot evening early in July, a young man came out of the garret in which he lodged in S Place and walked slowly, as though in hesitation, towards K Bridge. He had successfully avoided meeting his landlady on the staircase. His garret was under the roof of a high 5-storied house, and was more like a cupboard than a room. The landlady who provided him with garret, dinners, and attendance lived on the floor below, and every time he went out he was obliged to pass her kitchen, the door of which invariably stood open. And each time he passed, the young man had a sick, frightened feeling which made him scowl and feel ashamed. He was hopelessly in debt to his landlady and was afraid of meeting her. Have you read Crime and Punishment? I actually have never read it all the way through. Now here's one that I have read all the way through and enjoyed very much. I read most of this series. It's by Marcel Proust. This is Swan's Way. It's volume 1 in remembrance of things past. And I would highly, highly recommend this series. Okay, let's find the overture. Overture. For a long time I used to go to bed early. Sometimes when I had put out my candle, my eyes would close so quickly that I had not even time to say, I am going to sleep. And half an hour later, the thought that it was time to go to sleep would awaken me. I would try to put away the book, which I imagined was still in my hands, and to blow out the light. I had been thinking all the time, while I was asleep, of what I had just been reading, but my thoughts had run into a channel of their own, until I myself seemed actually to have become the subject of my book, a church, a quartet, the rivalry between Francois I and Charles V. This impression would persist for some moments after I was awake. It did not disturb my mind, but it lay like scales upon my eyes, and prevented them from registering the fact that the candle was no longer burning. Then it would begin to seem unintelligible, as the thoughts of a former existence must be to a reincarnate spirit. The subject of my book would separate itself from me, leaving me free to choose whether I would form part of it or no, and at the same time my sight would return, and I would be astonished to find myself in a state of darkness, pleasant and restful enough for the eyes, and even more perhaps for my mind, to which it appeared incomprehensible, without a cause, a matter dark indeed. Alright, let's see what's next. T.H. Lawrence, Sons and Lovers. When I was in college, I loved T.H. Lawrence. When I reread him as an older person, I wasn't quite as fond of him anymore, but I still like him now and then. Okay, let's see. Chapter 1. The Early Married Life of the Morels. The Bottoms succeeded to Hell Row. Hell Row was a block of thatched, bulging cottages that stood by the brookside on Greenhill Lane. There lived the colliers, who worked in the little gin pits 2 fields away. The brook ran under the alder trees, scarcely soiled by these small mines, whose coal was drawn to the surface by donkeys that plodded wearily in a circle round a gin. And all over the countryside were these same pits, some of which had been worked in the time of Charles II. The few colliers and the donkeys burrowing down like ants into the earth, making queer mounds in the little black places among the cornfields and the meadows. And the cottages of these coal miners, in blocks and pairs here and there, together with odd farms and homes of the stockingers, straying over the parish, formed the village of Bestwood. Okay, now this next one is from one of my very favorite series of all times, and it is the Barchester Towers series by Anthony Trollope. Trollope is an amazing author, and if you haven't read him, I really, really recommend that you do. He was a contemporary of Charles Dickens, and their styles are pretty different, but they really balance each other nicely. They both have a lot of insight into human nature, but where Dickens tends to kind of go with more caricatures that get at the core of someone, Trollope is very psychologically driven, and I really appreciate that his female characters are just as developed as his male characters. Okay, let's jump in. Chapter 1, Hiram's Hospital. The Reverend Septimus Harding was, a few years since, a beneficed clergyman residing in the cathedral town of, let us call it Barchester. Were we to name Wells or Salisbury, Exeter, Hereford, or Gloucester, it might be presumed that something personal was intended, and as this tale will refer mainly to the cathedral dignitaries of the town in question, we are anxious that no personality may be suspected. Let us presume that Barchester is a quiet town in the west of England, more remarkable for the beauty of its cathedral and the antiquity of its monuments than for any commercial prosperity. That the west end of Barchester is the cathedral close, and that the aristocracy of Barchester are the bishop, dean, and canons, with their respective wives and daughters. I know that's a rather dry first paragraph, but I promise you it gets better from there. Okay, let's see. I think we're going to go back to some Russian literature. Back to Russia. Here we have Gogol's Dead Souls. Okay, so what I've been doing actually is, while I'm showing you guys the books that I found in the bookstore, I'm reading off of Project Gutenberg, which has all of the public domain texts copied down of these books. So the translation is a little different, but I think that's okay because that's kind of interesting. So if you're following along, just be aware that I'm reading a different translation. Chapter 1. To the door of inn in the provincial town of N, there drew up a smart chaise, a light spring carriage of the sort affected by bachelors, retired lieutenant colonels, staff captains, landowners possessed of about 100 souls, and in short all persons who rank as gentlemen of the intermediate category. In the chaise was seated such a gentleman, a man who, though not handsome, was not ill-favoured, not over-fat, and not over-thin. Also, though not old, he was certainly not very young. His arrival produced no stir in the town, and he was accompanied by no particular incident, beyond that of a couple peasants who happened to be standing at the door of a dram shop, exchanged a few comments with reference to the equipage rather than to the individual who was seated in it. "Look at that carriage," one of them said to the other. "Think you it will be going as far as Moscow?" "I think it will," replied his companion, "but not as far as Kazan, eh?" "No, not as far as Kazan." With that the conversation ended. Presently, as the chaise was approaching the inn, it was met by a young man in a pair of very short, very tight breeches of white dimity, a quasi-fashionable frock-coat, and a dickey fastened with a pistol-shaped bronze tie-pin. The young man turned his head as he passed the chaise and eyed it attentively, after which he clapped his hand to his cap, which was in danger of being removed by the wind, and resumed his way. Isn't it fascinating how different people translate the same text? I feel like some translators, go for that sort of more word for word, and others go for a more natural reading. Right. Oh, here's Tom Jones, which was a book I was supposed to read in college and did not. Very bad of me as an English literature major. Alright, let's find the first chapter. This book has a very long table of contents because the headings of the chapters are very long themselves. Alright, here we go. Book 1, Chapter 1. Book 1, containing as much of the birth of the foundling as is necessary or proper to acquaint the reader within the beginning of this history. Chapter 1. The introduction to the work, or bill of fare to the feast. An author ought to consider himself not as a gentleman who gives a private or eleemosynary treat. I just looked up eleemosynary, it means charitable. But rather as one who keeps a public ordinary, at which all persons are welcome for their money. In the former case, it is well known that the entertainer provides what fare he pleases, and though this should be very indifferent and utterly disagreeable to the taste of his company, they must not find any fault. Nay, on the contrary, good breeding forces them outwardly to approve and to commend whatever is set before them. Now, the contrary of this happens to the master of an ordinary. Men who pay for what they eat will insist on gratifying their palates, however nice and whimsical these may prove, and if everything is not agreeable to their taste, will challenge a right to censure, to abuse, and to their dinner without control. I think it's so charming the way that curse words are bleeped out in old literature. Alright, let's see. So many wonderful books to choose from. I think we should just read one more. Moby Dick by Herman Melville. This has one of my favorite opening chapters in literature. So we will take a look at the first paragraph. The narrator talks about how there's something in humans that's always drawn back to water. Is that true for you? Are you drawn to places with water nearby? Here we go. Chapter 1, Loomings. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There is nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, some time or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings toward the ocean with me. Well, my friends, I hope you've enjoyed browsing the bookstore with me. I hope you're feeling nice and sleepy, or that maybe you are asleep. I wish you happy reading